I didn't plan to become the kind of woman people remember. That night, I was just trying to finish my shift without breaking my heels or my dignity. The ballroom at the Pearl Meridian Hotel was glowing like a jewelry box, crystal chandeliers, mirrored walls, and a sea of expensive perfume floating over soft music. Everyone looked polished, smiling, and harmless. The kind of crowd that claps for charity while their watches cost more than my yearly salary. I was there because the agency sent me. Event staff, they said. Easy money, they said. A black dress, hair pulled tight, a tiny earpiece that made me feel like I belonged to a world where people whispered commands and others obeyed. My job was simple. Guide guests, fix seating problems, keep the night smooth. Smile, nod, disappear. But there are nights that refuse to stay smooth. The first time I noticed him, I didn't know his name. I just felt the air change, like the room had made space for someone important without anyone saying a word. People's bodies turned slightly. Conversations dipped lower. Even the waiters moved with extra care, like clinking glass might be a crime. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He stood near the center of the room, not on the stage, not seeking attention, yet attention bent toward him like metal to a magnet. Tall, dark suit, calm face, eyes that didn't rush. He looked like he had nothing to prove because the world had already decided he was dangerous. I'd seen men like that on screens. Not in real life. Not this close. Someone near me whispered his name like it was a prayer and a warning at once. Kaif Rahman. The rumor-heavy name that floated around the city's sharp edges. Business, politics, protection money, disappearances that never made the news. People called him a businessman in daylight and something else at night. I told myself I didn't care. Men like him didn't belong in my world. And then my world stepped directly into his. It started small, a VIP guest insisting his table was wrong, his seat too far from the stage, his mood too expensive to ignore. I approached him with my practiced smile and my calm voice. He was middle-aged, slick hair, the kind of grin that got wider the more uncomfortable you became. He didn't want a better table. He wanted an excuse. His eyes moved over me slowly, like I was a product. Then he leaned in too close, close enough that I could smell the sweetness of his drink and the arrogance behind it. I took half a step back, polite but firm, and told him I would speak to the coordinator. He blocked my path with his shoulder. A tiny motion. A simple trick. In a crowded room. It looked like nothing. But I felt it, felt the control in it, the belief that he could corner me because he wore a tuxedo, and the night was full of witnesses who would pretend they didn't see. I tried again to move. His hand brushed my wrist. Not a grab, not quite. Just enough to test what he could get away with. Something hard, an old rose in my chest. Not fear. Not panic. Anger. I'd spent too many years swallowing my words to keep peace. Too many months smiling through disrespect because that's how you survive. And I didn't know what it was about that ballroom. Maybe the lights, maybe the hypocrisy, maybe the way the rich looked at people like me as part of the furniture, but my patience snapped clean. I looked straight into his eyes and raised my voice just enough for the people closest to us to hear. I told him, clearly, that his seat wasn't the problem. His manners were. I told him to remove his hand and step aside. I didn't scream. I didn't insult him with dramatic words. I simply refused to shrink. That's what shocked people the most. Not what I said. The fact that I said anything at all. Around us, a few heads turned. A few smiles froze. The man's grin faltered, then twisted into something uglier. He leaned closer, like he wanted to punish me quietly. You know who I am, his eyes seemed to say. I didn't. And even if I did, I wasn't going to let it change my spine into a question mark. I told him, again, to step aside. This time more people noticed. A ripple moved through the nearest tables. I could feel attention gathering like a storm. The man's face colored. He didn't like being corrected, especially by someone he considered smaller. He raised his hand, not to hit me, at least not openly. More like a gesture, a threat that could become anything. That's when I felt it again. The shift. The room making space. Kaif Rahman was moving. He didn't rush. He didn't show anger. He simply walked toward us with the calm certainty of someone who had never been told no without consequences. The VIP guest straightened the moment he saw him, like a dog realizing the bigger predator had arrived. Kaif stopped beside me, close enough that I could feel warmth from his body, the scent of expensive cologne, and something sharper beneath it: steel, control, warning. Everyone watched now. Even the music felt quieter. The guest tried to smile. He spoke fast, respectful, too respectful. His voice suddenly had fear in it. I understood then that I'd been dealing with a man who thought he was powerful until real power entered the frame. Kaif didn't look at him first. He looked at me. Not at my dress. Not at my legs. Not like the VIP guest had. He looked at my face, like he was reading the decision I'd made. And then he smiled. A slow, surprising smile that didn't match the tension. It wasn't mocking. It was pleased. Like he'd just watched something rare happen in a room full of predictable people. The crowd didn't understand it. I didn't understand it either. I expected him to be offended, because I'd made a scene, because I disrupted the illusion, because men like him usually didn't tolerate chaos. Instead, he looked almost entertained. His eyes moved back to the VIP guest. The smile stayed, but the warmth left it, turning it into something colder. Without raising his voice, Kaif made it clear the guest had crossed a line. The words were calm, but the message was brutal. He didn't have to threaten. The room already knew what he was capable of. The guest stumbled backward, apologizing, sweat shining at his hairline. He left quickly, disappearing into the crowd as if the floor might swallow him. And just like that, I was still standing. Unhurt, unpunished, protected by the last person I wanted protection from. The ballroom was frozen in that moment. People were staring at me now the way they stared at Kaif. Curious, cautious, as if I'd become dangerous by association. Kaif remained beside me, still too close. I should have stepped back. I should have thanked him politely and walked away. But his attention held me in place. In a room full of wealthy women who laughed too loudly and men who shook hands like deals were blood oaths, he was looking at me like I was the only unpredictable thing in the building. He leaned in slightly, not enough to look intimate to the crowd, but enough that I heard him and no one else did. The smile returned, almost gentle. I didn't catch every word over the music and the heartbeat in my ears, but I understood the meaning perfectly. He had been searching for someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who didn't bow. Someone who could stand in front of a crowd and refuse to be owned. My throat went dry. Because men like him didn't search for people like me to admire them. They searched to collect them. I forced my feet to move. I told myself I would walk away, go back to my duties, pretend this night was just another job. But as I turned, a man in a dark suit appeared at my side. One of Kaif's men, silent and watchful, not touching me but blocking my path in a way that made the message clear. Kaif's voice followed, calm as ever. Not a request. An invitation that felt like a door closing behind me. And when I glanced back, I saw something else that chilled my skin more than Kaif's attention ever could. Across the room, near the back wall, another pair of eyes watching. Not curious. Not impressed. Angry. Focused. As if my small public defiance had just started a war I didn't know existed. And Kaif Rahman was still smiling, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment all his life. I didn't go back to smiling after that. My hands kept moving because they had to, placing programs, guiding late guests to their seats, nodding at people who suddenly treated me like I had teeth. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't pride. It was the strange, sick feeling of being seen by the wrong person in the right way. Kaif Rahman didn't touch me again in the ballroom. He didn't need to. His presence stayed wrapped around me like a shadow that didn't care where the lights were. Every time I looked up, I caught people watching from a careful distance. Not out of admiration. Out of calculation. They were measuring me, deciding whether I had become important or just doomed. When the event ended, the staff line formed near the service exit. My supervisor was handing out envelopes and forcing a tired cheer into her voice. The night air outside was cold enough to sting, and the city sounded normal again. Car horns, distant sirens, people laughing like nothing dangerous ever happened in ballrooms. I kept my head down. I told myself I'd fade back into my regular life the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk. But a black car was waiting, not blocking the exit, not causing a scene, just parked at the curb like it belonged there. Its windows were dark, and the engine was running, steady and patient. It looked less like transportation and more like a decision. My supervisor said nothing, but her eyes slid away from mine too quickly. Even she understood this wasn't about staff scheduling. A man stepped out. Same dark suit as the ones inside. Same quiet, controlled movement. He didn't approach like someone coming to negotiate. He approached like someone delivering instructions. He held a small envelope. I stared at it, then at him. Around us, the other workers suddenly found reasons to be busy, to stare at their phones, to walk faster. No one wanted to be part of whatever this was. I took the envelope because refusing felt like pulling a pin I couldn't see. Inside was a card. Thick paper. A single address.
A time.
Noon tomorrow. And a name I already knew, printed like it was a company logo instead of a man. Alongside the card was something else, an access badge. My photo wasn't on it. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of authority that didn't depend on your face. The man returned to the car without another word. The door shut softly, like the end of a conversation. Then the car drove away. I stood there longer than made sense, the envelope cold in my fingers. My body wanted to shake off the night, to call it a story I could tell my friends later. But my instincts, the ones shaped by years of reading rooms and surviving moods, told me this wasn't a story. It was a rope. At home, the walls felt thin. My apartment was small and ordinary, the kind of place no one important ever visited. I locked the door, checked it twice, and leaned my forehead against the wood as if I could press my fear back into my bones. I didn't have anyone to call who could understand a man like Kaiferman. There are things you don't say out loud because once you do, they become real enough to punish you. I washed my face. I changed clothes. I tried to eat and tasted nothing. And still, my mind kept returning to that moment in the ballroom. The way he smiled, not as a flirtation, but as recognition. Like he'd been waiting to witness my refusal. I kept telling myself I could ignore the card. I could throw it away. I could block the number that would probably follow. I could stay small. But the idea of ignoring him didn't feel like freedom. It felt like stepping into the street and pretending cars weren't real. Close to midnight, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. No name. No greeting. Just a short message with a single sentence that made my stomach drop. A warning, sharp and plain, telling me the crowd had watched, and not everyone had smiled. I read it 3 times, waiting for my brain to reject it as paranoia. It didn't. It settled into me like a stone. Then another message arrived, this time from a different number. A location pin.
A time.
The same time as the card. It wasn't asking. It was mapping. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside my window felt too purposeful. Every passing car made me hold my breath until it faded. I hated that I was afraid, and I hated even more that my fear felt practical. By morning, exhaustion had sanded my thoughts down into something simpler. I could either meet Kaif on my terms, in daylight, with witnesses nearby, or I could keep wondering when his world would reach into mine again. At 11, I dressed in my plainest clothes. No makeup, no jewelry, hair tied back. If I was going to walk into a lion's den, I refused to do it as decoration. The address on the card belonged to a glass building in the financial district, clean lines, security desks, polished floors, and employees who looked like they belonged in magazines about success. The name on the building wasn't Kaif's. It was a corporate front, a respectable mask. My badge opened the first gate without resistance. That was the first time I understood the weight of being expected. Inside, the air smelled like money and controlled temperature. People moved quickly, speaking into headsets, carrying laptops like weapons. No one glanced at me twice, not because I blended in, but because my access badge did the blending for me. An elevator opened as I approached, already waiting. I stepped in and felt my pulse climb as the door shut. Up and up, floor numbers ticking higher. My reflection in the steel doors looked too pale, too stubborn, too awake. When the elevator opened, a hallway stretched ahead, quiet carpet, soft lights, a single door at the end guarded by two men in suits who didn't pretend to be anything else. They looked at me, then stepped aside. The door opened before I reached it. Kaif was inside, not behind a desk like a movie villain, but standing near tall windows that showed the city like it belonged to him. Daylight should have made him look less threatening. It didn't. In the sun, he looked even more real. He didn't rush to speak. He let silence do what it always does around powerful men, force the other person to fill it. I stayed standing. I refused to be the first to bow, the first to soften. His gaze moved over me once, quick and assessing, then returned to my face. That same calm interest was there, like last night had been a test, and I'd passed. Because men like him didn't search for people like me to admire them. He made an offer without making it sound like one. He framed it like an opportunity, like a partnership, like the natural next step after a public scene. He implied my boldness was useful. He suggested I could be placed where my voice would matter, where my refusal would become an asset instead of a risk. And beneath that polished logic, there was something else. A claim. Not romantic. Not tender. The kind of claim a person makes over a valuable thing they've discovered in a room full of expensive, boring objects. I listened until the shape of his proposal became clear. He wanted me close, not because I was qualified for his world, but because I disrupted it in a way that amused him, and because his enemies had witnessed it too. When I tried to reject him, I didn't use dramatic words. I didn't insult him. I simply told him, as steadily as I could, that I was not looking for that kind of life. That I wanted to go back to being invisible. Kaif's expression didn't harden.
It softened.
Not with kindness, more like satisfaction. As if my refusal confirmed what he already believed about me. He moved slightly, angling his body between me and the windows. It was subtle, almost polite, but the message landed anyway. In this room, he decided where space existed. That was the moment I realized I hadn't come here to negotiate. I'd come here to be studied. My phone buzzed again, suddenly, violently loud in the quiet office. Unknown number. A photo. It showed the service exit of the hotel from last night. It showed me standing there with the envelope in my hand. The photo had been taken from close range. The next image arrived before I could breathe. My apartment door. My name on the mailbox. My skin went cold, all the heat draining out of my face so fast I felt dizzy. Across the room, Kaif watched the change in me like he'd predicted it. He didn't need to ask what I'd seen. He already knew. He'd known the moment I walked into his building that the crowd's shock wouldn't stay contained to gossip. He stepped closer, not fast, not urgent, but with the calmness of a man who expected danger and treated it like weather. Then the glass in the window behind him trembled. Not from wind. From a sound that hit the building a half-second later. Sharp, violent, unmistakable. A crack like the sky splitting. One of the guards by the door moved instantly, hand rising toward his earpiece. Another shifted his stance, body turning slightly as if he could shield Kaif with bone and suit fabric. My mind lagged behind what my body already understood. This wasn't a warning. This was an attack. I backed up without meaning to, my heel catching on the edge of the carpet. For a second, I thought I might fall right there in a room that smelled like power. Kaif didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked almost disappointed, as if his enemies couldn't even manage originality. He moved, fast now, closing the space between us in 2 steps. Not grabbing me, not dragging me, just positioning me where his men could cover us, where the angles of glass and hallway and open space suddenly mattered. The sound came again, closer, followed by the muffled chaos of shouting in the corridor beyond the door. In the same breath, my phone buzzed one more time. A single line of text. A promise from someone who had watched me stand up in a ballroom and decided I should pay for it. And as the office around me shifted from luxury to battlefield, the terrifying truth sharpened into focus. I hadn't shocked the crowd last night. I had challenged a world. And Kaif Rahman, still unnervingly calm, was looking at me like I'd finally stepped into the part of my life he'd already written. The third shot never landed where it was meant to. It hit the window frame and sent a sharp spray of glass dust across the floor, like glitter with teeth. For half a second, the office still looked beautiful. Sunlight, skyline, expensive furniture. Then reality pushed through the cracks, and everything became angles and cover and distance. Kaif's men moved like they had practiced this kind of chaos 100 times. Not frantic. Not heroic. Efficient. One of them pulled the heavy curtains across the glass, turning the room into a dim cave. Another locked the door and spoke into his earpiece with a voice that didn't rise, like fear was something he refused to offer. I stood in the middle of it. Useless. My phone still lit with the last message that had turned my spine to ice. My apartment door. My name. My life. The meaning was obvious. They could reach me whenever they wanted. They were choosing not to yet. Kaif looked at me once, brief and assessing, like he was deciding how much truth I could hold without breaking. Then he shifted his body again, placing himself between me and the door as if his presence could do what walls couldn't. Somewhere outside, people were yelling. Footsteps pounded along the hallway. A distant alarm started to wail, thin and high, turning the building's calm into panic. Kaif moved toward a side panel on the wall I hadn't noticed. He pressed his hand to it, and the panel slid open, revealing a narrow door that led into a service corridor. A hidden exit in a tower made of glass, proof that this building was built for someone who expected violence as a regular visitor. The corridor smelled of metal and disinfectant. The lights were harsher here, fluorescent and unforgiving. We moved quickly, my shoes whispering on the floor, my breath louder than it should have been. I kept waiting for my body to catch up and start shaking. It didn't. Fear doesn't always arrive as trembling. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. I understood, in a single clean slice of thought, that I had become a lever in someone else's war. Last night's scene wasn't just gossip. It was a signal, a declaration, a spotlight turning toward me, and enemies deciding the easiest way to reach Kaif was through the girl who had embarrassed a man in public and earned the Mafia boss's smile. The service corridor ended at a stairwell. Kaif's men went first, scanning angles, listening, making hand signals. Kaif stayed behind me, close but not touching, a steady pressure at my back that forced me forward. We started down. Stairs, 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 concrete steps that echoed under hurried feet. My lungs burned from the pace. The building's distant panic followed us like thunder, but inside the stairwell it was quieter, more intimate, as if violence had narrowed the world to breath and footsteps. Halfway down, the door at the next landing shuddered. A sound like a fist hitting steel. One of Kaif's men froze, lifted a hand. Everything stopped. In that pause, I heard the faintest scrape, something moving on the other side of the door, careful and deliberate. Someone waiting for us to open it. Kaif didn't hesitate. He didn't step forward to be brave. He stepped forward because he was the kind of man who did not outsource danger. He pulled a weapon from inside his suit jacket so smoothly that it looked like part of his body. The sight of it made my mouth go dry. I'd known, intellectually, that he carried one. But seeing it made the idea of him real in a new way, less rumor, more weight. He didn't look at me when he raised it. He looked at the door. And then he did something that made my stomach lurch with a strange mixture of horror and awe. He smiled again. Not warm. Not kind. A smile meant for the unseen person waiting beyond the door. A smile that said he was not surprised, not worried, and definitely not leaving. One of his men slipped a small device onto the lock, something quick, quiet, practiced. A click. The door opened a fraction. Kaif kicked it wide. The next seconds blurred into movement and sound. A figure rushed in. A flash of metal. A sharp, muted pop that didn't sound like movies, more like a hard cough. The attacker fell backward, hitting the wall and sliding down like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I stared at the body, my brain refusing to label it as a person because labeling it would make me confront what had just happened. My heart hammered against my ribs, loud enough that I thought everyone could hear it. Kaif stepped over the fallen man as if he were stepping over a broken chair.
He didn't stop to check.
He didn't look down. He didn't apologize to the air. His men moved past, clearing the landing. Kaif finally looked back at me, his face unreadable in the fluorescent light. There was no cruelty in his eyes, but there was no softness either. Just an expectation that I would keep moving, because stopping was a luxury the living could not afford. We kept going. By the time we reached the underground parking level, my legs were shaking from effort even if my hands weren't. The air down here was colder, thick with the smell of concrete and fuel. A black armored SUV waited near the far wall, engine running, lights off, like it had been expecting us. 2 more men appeared from the shadows to flank us. They opened the back door, and I climbed in before I could think too much about what it meant to be ushered into Kaif Rahman's vehicle like I belonged there. Kaif climbed in after me. The door shut with a heavy, sealed sound. For a moment, everything inside the SUV was strangely quiet. Dim leather, tinted windows, the low hum of the engine. It felt like being inside a moving vault. As the vehicle rolled forward, the city outside became a smear of gray concrete and sharp turns. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and tried to breathe evenly, tried to pull my thoughts into a line. Kaif sat across from me, his posture relaxed in a way that felt unreal after what had happened. One of his hands rested near his knee, calm and steady, as if he were in a meeting, not escaping an attack. I wanted to ask questions. 100 of them.
Who were they?
Why now? Why me? How did they find my apartment so fast? But my pride didn't let me beg, and my fear didn't let me speak carelessly. I could feel that every word mattered in his world, the way a single wrong step could trigger consequences. Instead, I watched him. Up close, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had learned to carry violence the way others carried stress, something present, something controlled, something that didn't need to announce itself. His attention drifted to my phone, still in my hand. The screen was dark now, but the images were burned into my memory. My door. My name. The message that proved the threat was personal. Without touching me, Kaif shifted his gaze back to my face, and something in his eyes changed slightly, like the part of him that found me interesting was now calculating what it would cost to keep me alive. The SUV took a sudden, hard turn. My shoulder bumped the seat. Outside, I heard the faint whine of another engine accelerating. Kaif's head lifted, his focus sharpening. The driver muttered something into the radio. The men around us stiffened. The air inside the vehicle tightened. Then the first impact hit. Not a crash, more like a violent shove against the side of the SUV. The vehicle lurched. Tires squealed. My stomach dropped as the world tilted and corrected. A second impact followed immediately. Someone was trying to force us into a barrier. Kaif's men moved fast. One of them pulled a weapon, aiming toward the rear window. Another leaned forward, shouting instructions to the driver. The SUV surged forward, then swerved hard again. I caught a brief glimpse through the front windshield. Another black car behind us, too close, and in the distance, a third vehicle sliding into position. A clean, coordinated pursuit. This wasn't a random attacker. This was a message delivered with precision. Kaif stayed calm.
Too calm.
As if he'd been expecting the chase the moment the first shot hit his office window. And that terrified me more than the gunfire. Because it meant he lived in a world where this was normal. The SUV raced toward an underpass. Concrete walls rushed by on both sides. The sound of engines echoed like a drumbeat. My fingers clenched around the seatbelt strap I hadn't even thought to buckle. The pursuing car drew closer, its headlights flaring in the rear mirror like eyes. Kaif's gaze flicked toward me one more time. Not pity, not apology, but a look that felt like a vow forming in silence. Then the underpass lights flickered overhead, and I realized with a cold rush that the trap wasn't behind us. It was ahead. Because at the far end of the underpass, where the road should have opened into daylight, a large vehicle sat sideways across the exit, blocking the way. Waiting. And our driver didn't slow down. Thought for 17ths. The driver didn't slow down because slowing down would have meant accepting the trap. The SUV surged forward, engine growling, and in the split second before impact, I understood what Kaif's calm really was. It wasn't confidence. It was familiarity. He lived in emergencies the way other people lived in routines. The blocking vehicle at the end of the underpass was a large delivery truck parked sideways, its rear wheels angled like it had been shoved into position fast. No hazard lights. No driver visible. Just a wall of steel and a promise of collision. Kaif's men moved in the same breath the danger became certain. One leaned forward, bracing against the seat, hands ready to grab me if the vehicle rolled. Another shifted his aim toward the narrow gap between the truck and the concrete barrier, measuring if we could slip through. We couldn't. The SUV hit the brakes for a heartbeat, just enough to change the angle, then accelerated again. The impact wasn't a movie crash. It was a violent, bone-deep slam that rattled my teeth and filled my ears with a burst of ringing silence. My body pitched forward against the strap I'd finally clipped across my chest. The air smelled suddenly of hot rubber and metal, the inside of the SUV becoming a tight box of breath and adrenaline. The truck shuddered, moved inches, not enough. The SUV recoiled, tires squealing. For a moment we were stuck in the underpass like an animal in a snare, boxed in by concrete and headlights and the knowledge of the cars closing in behind us. Then the driver did something that made my stomach drop with fresh dread. He turned hard, aiming not for the truck, but for the side wall. The SUV lunged toward the concrete barrier, and I realized he wasn't trying to crash. He was trying to climb. The vehicle struck the wall at an angle, metal grinding against concrete, and the right side lifted slightly, tires bouncing. Sparks sprayed, bright and angry, and the SUV jolted upward just enough to slide along the wall's edge. The maneuver tore at the undercarriage, a scream of friction, but it created what we needed, a sliver of space. We weren't going through the truck. We were going around it, scraping our way through a gap, so narrow it felt impossible. The SUV squeezed past, body shuddering, mirrors nearly kissing concrete. I held my breath until my lungs ached, convinced we'd wedge and stop and become a target. But the driver kept the pressure steady, a surgeon with a steering wheel, and suddenly we were out of the underpass and into daylight, the city opening ahead like a throat. Behind us, chaos erupted. The pursuing cars fought to adjust, one braking too late and clipping the truck, another swerving wide. A brief advantage, measured in seconds. Kaif didn't celebrate it. He didn't even look relieved. He simply leaned slightly toward the driver, his attention sharpening, and I could feel decisions being made around me without my input. The SUV veered off the main road almost immediately, diving into side streets, then narrower streets, then an industrial stretch where the buildings grew uglier and the traffic thinned. The city changed personality here. The polished world of glass towers gave way to warehouses and chain-link fences and the smell of old oil. My fingers were numb from gripping the seat. The rear window showed flickers of movement, shadows of vehicles still following, stubborn as hunger. They had planned this too well. The underpass was not their only option. It had just been their loudest. One of Kaif's men pulled something from a pouch, small and round, and rolled it across the floor toward the door without looking at me. Another pressed a button on the window control, and the glass thickened with a descending shade, turning the outside into a darker blur. The SUV took another brutal turn. The men braced. The round object on the floor clicked. A moment later, a cloud bloomed behind us, visible even through the dimmed rear glass, thick smoke swallowing the road, a sudden curtain thrown over the chase. I didn't know if it was enough, but I saw headlights wobble and vanish into it, and the sound of engines behind us fractured. The driver pushed harder. We cut through a narrow lane between two warehouses, then ducked under a half-open loading gate that should not have been open. The SUV slid inside, tires skidding on dusty concrete. The gate rattled down behind us with a hard slam, sealing the light out. For the first time since the first shot in Kaif's office, the sound of pursuit stopped feeling immediate. The world outside still existed, still dangerous, but it wasn't inches from my spine anymore. The warehouse was dim, cavernous, packed with stacked crates, and the faint smell of wood and salt. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator hummed. It wasn't an abandoned building. It was prepared. Another car sat inside, smaller, matte, plain enough to disappear in daylight. I stared at it and felt something cold settle into place in my mind. This wasn't improvisation. This was infrastructure. Kaif's men moved quickly, scanning corners, checking exits, their movements so practiced it hurt to watch. Kaif stepped out last, smooth as if we'd merely arrived early to a meeting. When my feet hit the concrete, my legs finally remembered they were human. A tremor ran through them, subtle but real. I steadied myself by pressing my palm against the SUV door, breathing in air that smelled like dust and old cargo. Kaif's gaze found mine. In the dimness, his eyes looked darker, harder to read. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer comfort. Instead, he evaluated. As if my reaction mattered. As if he'd been measuring my limits since the ballroom. He led us toward a side door hidden behind stacked crates. The corridor beyond it was narrow and clean, lined with white tiles that didn't match the warehouse's roughness. Security cameras dotted the corners. The floor was too spotless for a place meant to be forgotten. We passed into a small suite of rooms that felt like a private bunker, sparse furniture, bottled water, medical supplies, spare clothing in sealed plastic. A place meant for waiting out storms. I sank onto the edge of a couch before my knees betrayed me. My throat felt tight, my mouth dry, and my brain kept replaying the image of the attacker collapsing in the stairwell, the way life had left his body like a switch flipping. I wasn't built for this. And yet I was here. Kaif stood across the room, phone in hand now, giving silent instructions to people I couldn't see. His men rotated positions, some leaving, some staying, a constant shuffle of protection. It should have made me feel safer. It didn't, because protection from a man like Kaif came with invisible chains. The side door opened again, and someone entered who didn't move like a soldier. She was older than me, maybe mid-40s, dressed in plain dark clothes that still somehow looked expensive. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face calm in the way people become calm when panic is a waste. She carried a small case in one hand and a tablet in the other. The room's energy shifted around her the way it had shifted around Kaif in the ballroom. Not from fear, exactly, but from recognition. She didn't glance at me first. She glanced at Kaif, and something passed between them that looked like an argument condensed into a single look. Then her eyes settled on me. They were sharp. Not cruel. Not warm. Like a person who had learned to survive by seeing what others tried to hide. Kaif's world had another axis, and she was standing on it. She set the case on the table, opened it, and pulled out a small first aid kit. One of Kaif's men had a scrape on his knuckles, and she treated it with quick hands, barely looking down. Competence like muscle memory. When she finished, she reached into her case again and pulled out a folder. A thick folder. She placed it on the table and slid it across the surface toward Kaif with a quiet finality. Kaif didn't open it immediately. He stared at it as if he already knew what was inside. I watched the folder because everything in this room suddenly felt connected to it. Every bullet, every chase, every unseen decision. Kaif finally opened it, flipping through pages without emotion. Photographs. Printouts.
Notes.
My chest tightened as I realized what I was seeing. Those were pictures of me. Not from last night. From different days, different angles, different places. Me leaving my apartment building weeks ago. Me on the bus. Me at a small grocery store. Me walking under rain with my head down. Some of the photos looked older, years older. One showed me standing outside a government office, younger, thinner, hair in a different style I hadn't worn since I was barely an adult. Another showed me with someone beside me whose face was blurred in the print, as if the camera had chosen to erase them. My skin prickled all over. I looked at Kaif, then at the woman, then back at the folder. The room felt suddenly too small for the air inside it. This wasn't protection that began last night. This was a tension that had been building long before I ever stood up in a ballroom. Kaif's gaze lifted from the pages to my face, measuring my reaction, calm as ever. The woman's expression stayed neutral, but her eyes didn't. There was something there that looked like warning. And in that moment, the truth formed in my mind with brutal clarity. The VIP guest who cornered me at the event, the timing of Kaif's arrival, the access badge waiting with my path already mapped. None of it felt random anymore. My defiance had been real. But the stage it happened on might have been chosen. Kaif turned one more page in the folder, and I caught sight of a name printed at the top of a document. A name I hadn't heard spoken in years, a name I tried not to remember, because remembering it meant remembering everything that came with it. My father's name. The room didn't spin, but my sense of ground did. My fingers went cold. My heartbeat slowed in a way that felt wrong, like my body was bracing for a hit it couldn't dodge. Kaif looked at the document, then looked at me again, his calm finally changing into something heavier. Not regret. Not apology. Something like inevitability. And I understood, with a sudden crushing certainty, that I hadn't been pulled into Kaif Rahman's war by accident. I had been connected to it long before last night.
I just didn't know it yet. Yes.
The folder sat between us like a loaded weapon. I couldn't stop staring at those photographs. My life reduced to paper. My ordinary days turned into evidence. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin and everything to do with the illusion of privacy collapsing. Somewhere deep in my chest, anger sparked again, small but stubborn, trying to keep me from folding. I forced my hands to unclench. I forced my voice to stay steady inside my head, even if nothing came out of my mouth. Kaif kept flipping pages, as if he were reviewing quarterly reports. No panic. No surprise. The kind of calm that only exists when you've already done all the fearing in your life and replaced it with planning. The woman watched me watch the folder. Her gaze was too sharp to be kind and too controlled to be cruel. She seemed like the sort of person who didn't waste emotion on people she hadn't decided mattered. Then she reached for the folder and closed it with one smooth motion, like she was cutting off oxygen to a fire before it spread. She shifted her attention toward Kaif, and something tightened in her face, an invisible warning, the expression people use when they're trying not to argue in front of outsiders. It told me more than words could have. I realized then that she wasn't just a helper. She wasn't just a medic or a fixer. She was a boundary. If Kaif was the blade, she was the sheath that kept him from cutting things too early. My eyes found the tablet in her hand. The screen lit up with maps, timestamps, names blurred into secrecy. Even without reading it, I understood the meaning. This wasn't a single attack. This was a campaign. And they had planned for me to be in the center of it. The anger inside me flared, hot and clean. I had been proud of that moment in the ballroom, proud that I didn't freeze, proud that I refused to be touched. But now, looking at that folder, the pride twisted into something darker. If the stage had been arranged, if the cornering had been allowed to happen, then my courage had been used like bait. It wasn't just that I'd been watched. It was that someone had decided I would be tested. I stood up, slow and deliberate, not because my legs were steady, but because sitting felt too much like surrender. Kaif's gaze tracked my movement the way a hunter tracks a deer, not with hunger but with focus. He didn't step back. He didn't soften. He simply waited, as if my reactions were expected parts of a sequence. The woman's eyes flicked to my hands, as if checking whether anger would turn into something reckless. When she saw I wasn't reaching for anything, her attention eased by half a degree. She moved closer, not toward me, but to the side, placing herself where she could see both of us at once. It was a small tactical decision, and it made my stomach sink because it meant she was used to situations where people broke. Something in me refused to give her the satisfaction of watching it happen. I looked again at the folder, at the page with my father's name, and old memories rose like floodwater. Not warm memories. Not comforting ones. My father had been a man who existed more in absence than presence. He wasn't the kind who tucked you in at night. He was the kind who came home smelling like smoke and stress, threw money on the table like it solved everything, and disappeared again before dawn. When I was younger, I told myself he was working hard. When I got older, I learned that people who work hard don't need to hide. When he vanished for good, the silence he left behind was so sudden it felt like a door had been slammed on our lives. No funeral. No confirmation. Just a body-shaped gap in the world and the quiet, shameful understanding that asking questions could invite danger. I'd spent years trying to build a normal life on top of that gap. And now it was opening again. The woman finally did something that felt almost human. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, and I saw something like reluctant respect to her eyes. Respect for the fact that I hadn't collapsed, that I was still standing even when my past had been laid out like a crime scene. Then she walked to a cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a bottle of water. She set it within my reach, not offering it directly, not using comfort as a leash. It was the first gesture in this room that didn't feel like control. I took the water because my throat was too dry to keep pretending I was made of steel. The bottle crinkled in my grip. My hands were steadier than they should have been, and that scared me too. It meant my body was adapting. It meant I was already changing. The woman moved back to Kaif's side. Her posture stayed calm, but there was an edge in it, like she was trying to keep him contained. Like she knew exactly how dangerous he could become when emotions touched the wrong places. I watched them together and understood something else. They had history. Shared battles. Shared decisions. A trust built from surviving the same darkness. And then I realized the most unsettling part. Kaif didn't look at her the way a boss looks at an employee. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has stopped him from making mistakes more than once. That meant even Kaif had limits. And she was one of them. My eyes drifted to the wall where security cameras blinked quietly. A safe house like this wasn't meant for random emergencies. It was meant for storms that came regularly, for threats that were guaranteed. My mind started connecting pieces I didn't want to connect. If my father's name was in Kaif's file, it meant my father had touched Kaif's world. If the people attacking Kaif were also interested in me, it meant my father had touched their world too. And if Kaif had been watching me for longer than a night, it meant he'd known where that connection led. Which meant the ballroom might have been more than an accident. It might have been a test of loyalty before I even knew there was a side to choose. The thought made my stomach turn. I forced myself to look at Kaif again, to study his face for cracks. There were none. He seemed almost settled, as if the chaos had aligned things into a shape he preferred. I hated that. I hated that he looked like someone who had been waiting for me to step into his orbit. My phone buzzed again, and the sound made the entire room tighten. A new message. Unknown number, different from the ones before. No words this time. Just a photo. A grainy image taken from above, like from a rooftop or a drone. It showed a narrow street I recognized immediately because it was too ordinary to be mistaken, the street outside my apartment building. The angle captured the doorway, the mailbox, the small grocery across the road. And at the bottom of the frame, almost hidden by shadow, was a small figure. A woman. She stood under the awning like she belonged there, hands clasped, posture patient. Even through the grain, I recognized her shape. My mother. The breath left my lungs so fast I thought I might choke. My fingers tightened around the phone until it hurt. A second image arrived.
Closer this time.
My mother's face turned slightly as if she had heard something behind her. She looked tired, confused, unaware of how close danger was. Then the third message came. A location pin. Not my apartment. Somewhere else. Somewhere isolated. And beneath it, a single line of text that didn't need profanity to feel brutal. It said they would trade. Not for Kaif.
For me.
I lifted my gaze from the phone to Kaif, and for the first time, his calm shifted. Just slightly. A fraction of a second where something dangerous moved behind his eyes, like a locked door cracking open. The woman beside him leaned in, reading my face, and her expression hardened into something cold and immediate. In that split second, I understood the new shape of the war. This wasn't about punishing Kaif for a business deal. This was about dragging him into a choice. And they'd chosen my mother as the knife. I didn't know what terrified me more, the fact that they had found her or the fact that Kaif looked like he already knew what he was going to do. And in the heavy silence that followed, I realized another awful truth. If Kaif had been watching me for years, then he might have been watching my mother too. Which meant he hadn't just walked into my life last night. He had been standing near it all along. waiting for the moment he could step in and claim the disaster as his reason. My phone buzzed one last time. A video thumbnail appeared on the screen. My mother, alive, sitting in a dim room with her hands tied in her lap. The video didn't play yet, but I didn't need it to. My body already knew what it would show. Thought for tens. Chunk 5, female narration, 1,000 words. I didn't press play. Not because I didn't want to see my mother's face, but because I already knew what the video would do to me. It would pull something raw out of my chest and hand it to the people who were watching from the dark. They didn't need my tears. They needed my panic. So I held the phone with the screen glowing in my palm like a small, cruel sun, and I forced myself to breathe through the urge to break. Kaif's eyes stayed on me, not on the phone. Like he could read the message from my skin alone. His calm had shifted, just slightly, still controlled, still deadly quiet, but now sharpened by a new purpose. The kind of purpose that turned men into storms. The woman beside him stepped closer, and for the first time she spoke to me directly. Her voice wasn't gentle. It was steady. She told me to sit, not as an order meant to put me in my place, but as a practical instruction meant to keep me from collapsing at the wrong time. I hated that I listened. I hated even more that my legs obeyed like they had been waiting for permission to stop carrying my pride. I sat. Kaif didn't move. He didn't come to soothe me. He didn't make empty promises. Instead, he reached for the folder, pulled out one of the pages, and placed it on the table like a chess piece. A map. A set of coordinates. A name written at the top that didn't belong to a person, but to a place I'd never heard of, something industrial, something anonymous, something that sounded like it could be a warehouse or a shipping yard or a slaughterhouse. The same location pin that had been sent to my phone. He already knew the place. That made my stomach twist in a way fear alone couldn't explain. I looked up at him, and my voice finally escaped my throat, thin but sharp. I asked him how long he had been expecting this. His gaze didn't flinch. The answer wasn't given as an apology. It was given as a fact. His enemies didn't waste opportunities. They used them. And last night, the crowd had given them one. My jaw tightened so heart hurt. I told him last night wasn't an opportunity. It was my life. He watched me the way he had watched me in the ballroom when I refused to be touched. Like my anger didn't disgust him. Like it confirmed something he already believed. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could feel her attention sharpening, as if she was monitoring the way Kaif's interest in me could become a liability. She glanced at him with a look that said, "Don't forget the priority." Kaif didn't look away from me. He asked one question, simple, impossible. Did I want my mother alive? My throat burned. My vision blurred for 1 second, and I hated myself for it.
Of course I did.
I nodded, because words felt too small for something that big. Kaif's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anger. It looked like agreement with a cost. He turned toward the woman. Their exchange lasted only a few seconds, low voices, compact sentences. I didn't catch everything, but I caught enough to understand the shape of their plan. They would not go to the trade unprepared. They would not go blind. And they would not let the people who sent those photos control the terms. My stomach lurched anyway, because there was one phrase I heard clearly, spoken by the woman, sharp and absolute. No one trades with vultures without bleeding. I stared at the water bottle on the table and realized my hands were trembling now. Not from fear for myself. From fear that I would become the reason my mother died. I lifted my phone again, held the video thumbnail in the center of my palm like a confession, and I forced myself to look at it. My mother's face was angled slightly toward the camera, lips pressed into a line I recognized, the line she used when she didn't want to scare me. Even tied up, even trapped, she was trying to be strong for me. The fact that someone had captured that effort and sent it as leverage made something inside me go cold. I asked Kaif what they wanted. He answered without hesitation. They wanted him to come personally. They wanted him visible. They wanted him trapped in a moment where he would either choose to save me or choose to protect his empire. A public test, shaped like a private threat. They weren't trying to kill my mother because she mattered to them. They were trying to make Kaif show the world what I was worth. The anger in me rose again, sharp and clean, but this time it wasn't directed at the men holding my mother. It was directed at the idea that my life could be measured like currency. I looked at the woman. Something about her steadiness made me believe she'd tell the truth even if it was ugly. I asked her who she was. She paused. Then she gave me a name that sounded like it belonged to someone who had burned through identities and chosen the one that survived. Katerina. I remembered that name from nowhere and everywhere, like I'd seen it scribbled in the margins of rumors. Like it belonged to the kind of person who cleaned up messes powerful men couldn't admit they made. Katerina told me something else too, something that made my chest tighten. My mother wasn't the only one in danger. If the people who took her had files on my father, if they were connected to the name on those papers, then the story I thought ended years ago had never ended. It had just gone underground. Asked Kaif what my father had done. Kaif's eyes didn't soften, but his voice lowered, and in that lowered tone I heard something that wasn't pity. Respect, maybe. Or resentment. He said my father had worked for the wrong people, laundering money and moving information, playing too close to men who didn't forgive mistakes. He said my father had known secrets that turned allies into enemies. I whispered that my father was gone. Kaif held my gaze, with the calm cruelty of truth. He said, maybe. The word hit me like a slap. Maybe. Years of trying to accept the silence, years of building a life on top of it, and now a single word cracked it open again like glass. My mouth went dry. If my father wasn't gone, then he had chosen to disappear. He had chosen to leave us in the dark. He had chosen to let my mother carry the weight of his sins without explanation. I felt a hot, humiliating ache behind my eyes, and I swallowed it down. I wouldn't cry in this room. Not because I was strong. Because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me weaken. Kaif's phone buzzed. He read a message, and his expression barely changed, but the air in the room shifted the way it does before a storm. Katerina moved immediately, picking up her case, snapping it shut. Kaif's men began rotating positions again. The bunker was turning into an engine. Kaif looked at me and said we were leaving. I asked where. He answered with a word that made my skin prickle. To the trade. My breath caught. Katerina stepped in before I could speak, telling me the truth no one else was saying. I would be the bait no matter what I chose. If I refused to go, my mother might die. If I went, I might not come back. But there was one advantage to going. It would put me close enough to see who was really holding the rope. Kaif didn't contradict her. He didn't reassure me. He simply asked one more question, the kind that sounded polite but carried the weight of ownership. Would I do exactly as he said? My pride flared again, instinctive and stupid. Then I saw my mother's face in my mind, her hands tied, her eyes trying not to beg. And my pride became something else, a tool. I nodded. Kaif's gaze held mine for one long second, as if he were memorizing the version of me that still believed she had choices. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, and the men followed like shadows. Katerina touched my elbow briefly, light, precise, not a comfort, more like a warning delivered through skin. When we stepped back into the warehouse, the plain matte car was waiting. The armored SUV remained behind, wounded from the underpass scrape, like a beast that had taken a hit but refused to die. I climbed into the matte car, heart pounding, and for a second the silence inside it felt too clean. Kaif sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, but he didn't look at me. He looked forward, eyes focused, mind already 3 moves ahead. The engine started. The warehouse gate lifted just enough to let us slip out. And as we rolled into the daylight again, my phone buzzed one more time, one final message, short and sharp, like a knife tip under my ribs. A reminder that if Kaif tried anything clever, my mother's life would end on camera. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I lifted my gaze and saw, far ahead on the road, a line of trucks turning slowly toward an industrial district that didn't belong to any map tourists used. And I understood, with a cold certainty that made my blood feel heavy. We weren't heading to negotiate. We were heading into a trap that had been waiting for us long before I ever opened my mouth in that ballroom. The industrial district didn't announce itself with signs. It changed the air first, salt and rust, diesel and wet concrete. The buildings grew square, older, the streets emptier, like the city had decided this was where it left things it didn't want to see. Long fences ran beside us with warning boards and broken lights. Shipping containers stacked like giant bricks, cranes standing still like skeletons against the gray sky. We didn't drive straight in. We circled. Kaif's driver took turns that didn't make sense, doubled back, cut through narrow lanes where the tires hummed over uneven asphalt. It felt like a maze designed to confuse anyone following, and to confuse me too, if I ever tried to run. Katerina sat in the front seat, silent, listening to messages in her earpiece. Her stillness wasn't comfort. It was focus sharpened into a weapon. Kaif sat beside me in the back, close enough that I could feel him when the car shifted, but he didn't touch me.
He didn't look at me either.
His attention was forward, toward the trap, as if he'd accepted long ago that traps were just another kind of appointment. My phone buzzed once more. A message. A time countdown, crude and unnecessary, as if the people holding my mother wanted to hear my fear ticking louder than the clock. I locked the screen. I refused to give them even the satisfaction of my shaking hands. The car slowed near a wide gate that led into a yard filled with containers and parked trucks. No official security booth, no guards in uniforms, only men who looked like they belonged to violence, standing in small clusters, watching every vehicle that approached like they could smell intention. Our driver stopped before the gate. Kaif finally moved. He leaned forward and said something low to Katerina, and she nodded once, short, sharp, like the decision had already been made hours ago. She turned to look at me, and for the first time her eyes softened by a fraction. Not sympathy. Permission. She told me, very clearly, what would happen next. We would walk in. We would follow the rules on the surface. If I panicked, if I ran, if I screamed, it would become their excuse to execute my mother as a lesson.
She didn't say it to scare me.
She said it because she respected truth more than comfort. Then Kaif looked at me. His eyes were calm, but the calm had teeth now. He told me the same thing in fewer words. Stay close, stay silent, do exactly as I was told. I wanted to spit back that I wasn't his possession. The words rose to my tongue like heat. Then my mind flashed the image of my mother's face in that video thumbnail, her stubborn attempt to look brave for me. And the words turned into ash. I nodded. Not obedience. Strategy. We stepped out of the car. The cold hit my cheeks. The wind carried grit that clung to my lips. The yard felt too open, too exposed, yet every corner seemed to hide eyes. Men watched us approach. Some held their hands behind their backs like polite security. Some didn't bother hiding the outlines under their jackets. I kept my posture steady, shoulders back, jaw set. I wouldn't give them trembling. I wouldn't give them weakness. If I was the bait, I would be the kind of bait that cut. At the center of the yard, a warehouse door stood open, darkness inside like a mouth. A single man waited at the threshold, tall, slick suit, familiar grin, the same type of grin that had cornered me in the ballroom the first night. He wasn't the VIP guest from the gala, but he carried the same arrogance, the same entitlement, the same belief that women were tools and fear was entertainment. He smiled too widely as Kaif approached, as if he were greeting an old colleague instead of an enemy. He spoke as if he owned the moment. He welcomed Kaif into the warehouse, congratulated him for arriving on time, and then, like he couldn't help himself, his gaze slid to me. His eyes lingered. Not with admiration, with triumph, like he wanted me to understand that my refusal in public had been answered in private. Behind him, more men emerged from the darkness, forming a corridor of bodies. I counted them automatically. Too many to fight head-on without preparation. That's when I noticed something else. Kaif had come in with fewer men than he should have. It looked like surrender. But I had watched his world long enough to recognize a pattern. When Kaif looked most exposed, it was usually because he had hidden his strength somewhere else. We walked inside. The warehouse smelled like damp wood and metal. Light leaked in through high windows, catching dust motes that floated like ash. The sounds outside, wind, distant engines, faded into silence. Every footstep echoed too loudly, like the building wanted to remember who entered. We reached the center, and there she was. My mother sat on a chair beneath a hanging work light, her hands tied in front of her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were open and steady. When she saw me, something flickered in her, fear trying to hide behind relief. She didn't cry. That was my mother's cruelty and kindness at once. Even in terror, she tried to protect me from her terror. The man at the front gestured like a host unveiling a prize. He said something about trades, about lessons, about respect. He turned the moment into theater. That's what they always do, men like this. They don't just want power. They want the room to clap for it. He spoke to Kaif as if Kaif were the one begging. He said the deal was simple. Kaif would hand over what they wanted and my mother would go free. If Kaif tried anything clever, the light would go out, meaning her life would end in the dark where no one could witness it. Then he smiled at me again, slow and smug. He told me this was what happened when girls made scenes in front of crowds. He wanted me to shrink. He wanted me to regret. And something inside me, the same thing that had snapped in the ballroom, rose again, hot, familiar, fearless. I took one step forward before I could think. Kaif's hand rose slightly, a silent warning. I ignored it. The men around us shifted, tense, surprised, as if they didn't expect the bait to speak. I looked at the leader, looked him straight in the face in front of all his men, and I told him he was not powerful. Not really. Powerful men don't need to kidnap mothers. They don't hide behind guns and threats and staged lighting. They don't punish a woman for saying, "Don't touch me," by dragging her family into darkness. I told him this wasn't control. It was cowardice wearing a suit. The warehouse went still. Even my mother stared, eyes widening slightly, like she was seeing a version of me she hadn't known existed. I heard one of the men behind the leader let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, quickly smothered, but real. Respect slipping out where fear normally lived. The leader's smile twitched. His confidence cracked just enough for anger to leak through. He took a step toward me, and a hand reached for my arm. Before it could touch me, Kaif moved. Not in a dramatic rush. Not in a showy act. In a single smooth step, he placed himself beside me, his shoulder almost touching mine. A protective angle. A silent wall. And then, to my shock, he did it again. He smiled. Not at the leader. At me. A brief, unmistakable smile that said, "There you are." The men watching didn't understand that smile. They expected Kaif to punish me for speaking out of turn. They expected him to treat me like a liability. Instead, he looked pleased. Like my defiance wasn't a problem. It was the reason he was here. The leader's face tightened. He barked an order. One of his men shoved a gun closer to my mother's head, trying to regain control through terror. My mother flinched and my chest seized. That was the moment Kaif's calm finally broke, not into panic, but into something colder. Katerina's voice came through the warehouse speakers before anyone could locate her. Not loud.
Clear.
A single sentence that made the blood in my veins turn to ice with recognition. A countdown. Not theirs.
Ours.
Smoke detonated at the far end of the warehouse. Thick, fast, swallowing light. Shouts erupted. Footsteps thundered. Men lifted weapons, firing into gray nothing, hitting only air and panic. The room became a storm of confusion and echoing commands. Kaif grabbed my wrist, not hard, not cruel, just enough to pull me back behind him. For the first time, his touch didn't feel like ownership. It felt like survival. Katerina appeared from the haze like she had been born in it, moving straight for my mother with two men at her side. A knife flashed. The rope fell away. My mother's hands came free. I ran to her without thinking. She stood too quickly, knees weak, and I caught her before she fell. Her body shook in my arms, silent sobs trapped behind clenched teeth. I didn't let go. Over my mother's shoulder, through the smoke, I saw the leader stumbling backward, shouting, trying to gather his men into shape. Then another figure stepped into the light. into the thin space where the smoke curled away. A man who didn't rush, didn't crouch, didn't shout. A man who looked at the chaos like it was something he had expected. His face was older than the one in my memory, but the bones of it were the same. The way his eyes held distance. The way his mouth tightened, as if kindness was expensive. He looked at me, and in that single look, the years between us collapsed. I felt my mother stiffen in my arms, a sound caught in her throat. The man spoke my name, my real name, the one only family used, and my blood went cold. My father was alive. He stepped forward, ignoring the guns, ignoring Kaif, ignoring everything except the fact that I was standing there with my mother in my arms. And he said something that broke the world open in my head. He wasn't here as a hostage. He was here as the reason. Kaif's hand tightened around mine again, steadying me as if he could keep me from shattering. My father's gaze shifted to Kaif, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. He said this was never about business. It was about settling a debt. And then, like he was still the kind of man who believed he had the right to decide what happened to us, he told me to come with him. The smoke swirled. My mother clung to my arm. Kaif stood beside me, silent, deadly calm, returning like a mask. And I realized the trap had been deeper than I imagined. It wasn't just Kaif being tested. It was me. A choice placed in front of everyone. My mother watching, Kaif watching, armed men watching, like my life was still something men could trade. My father held out his hand. And before I could even breathe, I heard my own voice cut through the chaos. Clear, steady, unfamiliar even to me. I told him no. Not softly. Not politely. No, in front of everyone. No, the way I'd said it in the ballroom. No, like I was done being moved around a board I never agreed to play on. My father's face hardened. The warehouse held its breath. And beside me, Kaif Rahman smiled again, slow and stunned and almost proud, like he'd been looking for someone like me his whole life. Then the guns lifted. And the next second decided everything.